Hugh, you seem to want to do the impossible, to make God fully sovereign in his control, and to make human beings fully free in their free will. How do you harmonize such a contradictory position?
Well, harmonizing divine sovereignty and human freedom is in part going to depend on what you think human freedom is. It's in part going to depend on what you think divine sovereignty is, or how it is exercised by God. Now, in my view, human freedom is not a matter of us causing our own actions. And the reason is because if you cause your own actions, it has to be either by some other action that you perform, which leads to an infinite regress.
So my brain function is I'm thinking I want to move my arm, so I have to do something else with my neurons
in order
and brain,
to make yourself move your arm.
and then
Right.
it's an infinite regress.
Right, then it goes back, and because each time you have this separate action, you have to worry about whether it's free. Okay. Then the other possibility is you could cause the action as part of the action itself, but then you have something causing itself, and that doesn't seem right. So it doesn't look like you can have humans causing their action. That leaves you two options. One is there is no cause, and then you have to face classical objections against libertarianism, that it means that there are some events in the universe that is just purely random, have no explanation, whatever, and we're stuck with them.
And in that case, you don't really have free will anyway. You have randomness.
Well, you have randomness, and it just, it may be spontaneous, but there's not much more to it than that. And then the other alternative is you try to invoke God as cause and see if you can do so in such a way that human freedom is preserved. Right? So then you want to talk about these two things. First of all, what really is human freedom? Well, to me, what human freedom is that you're not acted upon by anybody or anything. So nothing is done to you that results in your choosing the way you choose. The other thing is that the choice is spontaneous, and I suppose that just goes with action as that kind of spontaneity. And the other thing is that choices are always intrinsically intentional. You can't decide to do something and not mean to decide, and in fact not mean to decide exactly what you're deciding. So it's not as if it befalls you or anything like that. And that would happen whether it was purely random or not. Okay, so that's what I think freedom consists in, and then I want to make divine causation consistent with that. And the way to do that, I think, is to realize that when God creates us or creates the universe, two things are true. First of all, God is not a temporal being, so he creates everything at once. And the other thing is that God doesn't choose among options. Right? It's not as if that there are two versions of Bob Kuhn and Hugh McCann, one pair of whom have this conversation, the other pair don't, and then God selects them. That's not what happens. What happens is just us. And what God does first is he creates us. So he doesn't select a thing. The only selecting that's done is done by you and me in framing questions and giving answers. And there's no reason why that can't be free.
Okay, so as I understand it, we have to deal with both sides of this problem, the human side and the God side. So let's start with the human side. Now, as you define human freedom, that didn't sound a lot different from what's called compatibilism, which is how you can be free in a deterministic world, forgetting God. If the laws of the universe were such and the initial conditions, you can predict everything, and so you have a compatibilistic thing. The differential for so-called libertarian free will is that at any moment I can always have done otherwise.
Sure. Well, okay, first of all, let's make the distinction between compatibilism and what I'm calling freedom. Compatibilism actually is not a view that makes your action uncaused or caused in such a way that you can still maintain all the features that I think are features of freedom, despite the fact that God's being the cause. Compatibilism says this. Compatibilism says something is done to you when you decide. Namely, you're forced to decide by some motive or the laws of nature or whatever. And that's not what happens on my view, because you come complete with your decisions. God doesn't operate on you. You're not there until he's done operating. Then you're there.
Okay, so you have the actuality of what you're doing. It's not something imposed on you
Right.
like the laws of nature.
Right, it's just
So-
something that is seen and willed
So
by
God
God.
creating it is not the same thing as the laws of nature generating
Producing
it.
it. Yeah, because God does not create by giving a command and then the command causes something to happen. I mean, that would be,
God just creates it and it's
just
there.
creates it and it's there.
It
Right.
shows up.
Right, it's the content of his creative act, not a consequence of it. Right.
And that's a distinction with a big difference.
Right,
Is that right?
yeah.
So let's go to the God side of the equation here, God's sovereignty. You're saying that God doesn't select among options. Now, many theists believe that God does.
Practically all of them.
Yeah, right. That's that there's an infinite, almost an infinite number, perhaps a real infinite number, and all the different computations and permutations of all the different things that can happen. And some would have God creating the universe in an open sense. God doesn't even know what's going to happen after creating it. Some think that God knew every possibility of who would do what and what condition, the so-called middle knowledge, and therefore actualized the one world in which God knew, so people were sort of free, but God knew which one. You say none of that's true.
Right, none of it.
None of it.
Well, I wouldn't say-
Throw it all away.
Maybe some of it's true, but I think most of it's not. First of all, it seems to me that only an inferior God would have to plan what universe he's going to create. What's he going to do? Is he guarding against error? Is that what it is? A perfect God doesn't commit errors. He's not in danger of committing errors. And so there's no reason to plan ahead. So that's one thing that's wrong with the sort of picture that I think most people entertain and that you. And
So in a sense, is this the best possible world?
well, if it is, it's only in retrospect, right? That is to say, it's not the case that in creating the world, God's looking over there are no possibilities until
This
he's
is
done
just it.
creating the world. This is it, right? Because he creates the possibilities in creating the things themselves, right?
And
So could have done otherwise, right? You mentioned earlier, is it really the case that you could have done otherwise? Well, prior to creation, or God creating you, there ain't no you to talk about, and so there aren't any possibilities about what you do to talk about, okay? Possibilities are things that you and I entertain about our future actions because we're already here, and we do go through the process of planning and agonizing and trying to avoid mistakes and so forth. God doesn't do any of that.
is that a toy game that we're playing? Because in reality, it's all
No,
set
it's real.
forth.
It's as real as it can be.
And God knows that only because God's not in time.
Right,
Or-
God
or-
sees the whole
or-
thing.
Or because God actually
God
created
sees-
in the first place.
That's what it really is. God is not in time, true. But he knows it by creating it. And the whole process is what he creates, not just bits and pieces of it. He doesn't jump in and produce a result from time to time. The whole thing is the result.
Even in God's timeless sense, there was a moment at the beginning of at least human time when all this was set in motion, right? In some sense.
Well, if you're going to do it like from a cosmological perspective, let's say, you're going to have one of two views. Either you're going to have an infinite past time with, say, multiple universes and
Contractions. And
oscillating
right,
universes and so forth. Or what you're going to do is you're going to say there was in fact a Big Bang prior to which there was no time.
Right.
So on that model, at least, yes, you do get a beginning of human time, or beginning of time as we understand it.
And when God set that in motion, that process, at that moment, or when God set the infinite series in motion, and from a timeless sense, God knew at that time that the whole, what it was going to be.
What you want to say is that in God's case, he knows it, and he knows it by creating it. You have to be very careful about using tenses with God.
Right, no, that's fine, I agree. So God knows it by creating it, and there were no other ever possibilities. So whatever happens, happens. But within the context, I feel like I have options, whether now when I'm talking to you to raise my left arm, which am I going to use as an example to talk
Well,
about
as far as we're
volition, right
concerned,
and
we
left
do
arm?
have
I
those
that.
options.
Yeah.
Because God isn't taking away options by creating us, he's just creating us the people who
You say creating us,
consider-
but God's creating the totality, you're saying.
Sure, but
All the actions, everything, it's not just
Sure.
God creating the environment for us to
Yeah,
work
but
in, it's
it's-
God creating the specific actions, everything we're doing. That's
Right,
what you're
but
telling
it's
me.
also the
Is that right?
it's also the contemplation of the possibilities, the recognition of them, the agonizing
Right,
over
right,
them.
everything,
all those
everything,
sorts
everything. Well,
of
God's
things too.
causing everything.
Right.
And I'm still free.
No, we're still
I'm still mystified.
well, because you think that one of two things. You think either there were prior possibilities, and I'm denying that, right? Because the possibilities aren't there until after the reality is there. Prior to the reality being there, there's nothing to be spoken of, right? Or you think if there aren't any prior possibilities, then there must have been a prior necessity. But there wasn't any prior necessity either. All there is what there is. There are no what we call de re modalities. For me, at least, that's what I kind of, in philosophy. There are no possibilities and necessities apply or pertain only to the conceptual realm, as far as I'm concerned.